All right. All right. So I think we're ready to start. And today is our next lecture about the 19th century. Last time we spoke a lot about the cultural cooperation. We have only very shortly spoke about the different tensions between our two countries. And today we'll have to make up for that because the 19th century saw intensive competition between the British and the Russian empires. As you remember, this sort of competition and envy on behalf of England began in the 18th century mainly. They were afraid that Russia was gaining access to the seas. They were afraid that Russia might pose a threat to the English naval power, because as you know, England rules the seas, right? This is their the stereotype. They are unmatched power on the seas. And at the beginning of the 19th century, the relationships between our two countries were somehow darkened by the assassination of Paul I, in whose assassination there is an English trail, an English trace, although, of course, it was done by conspirators here in Russia. But today we're going to speak of a competition on a grander scale, of course. Well, at first this begins not as a competition, but rather as a cooperation, because both Russia and England participate in a war for the independence of Greece. Greece had been occupied by the Ottoman, but what was to become the Ottoman Empire in the 15th century. And for 4 centuries, almost for 4 centuries, it remained a province of the Ottoman Empire. At times when the Greeks were trying to raise insurrections to start rebellions, they were brutally suppressed by the Turks. And of course, in the 18th century, it became obvious to many nations on the European continent that Greece was to become independent at one point. And Greece, of course, was just waiting for this moment to rebel and to gain independence. So at the beginning of the 19th century, Russia was, of course, a source of inspiration for those Greeks who wanted independence. A lot of Greeks served in the Russian army. There were a lot of Greek officers, and one of them, then, of course, if you remember, Catherine II, she had this idea of gaining Constantinople, of getting Constantinople back from the Turks, from the Muslims, and giving independence to Christians. So it isn't an accident that she called her sons Alexander in honor of Alexander of Macedonia, and another son was called not sons, of course, but grandsons, right? Alexander, who was to become Alexander I, and then this another grandson was called Constantine in honor of Constantine the Great, of course. And then when Malorossia and the Crimea were added to the Russian Empire, the new cities which were built there, and they were called largely by Greek names. If you remember, Sebastopol, Odessa, these are ancient names. Some of them are ancient names, some of them are new names of Greek colonies that used to exist on the shores of the Black Sea. So there was a general movement towards liberating the Greeks. And at the beginning of the 19th century, these events started, and an officer in the Russian service, Alexander Ypsilanti, started a revolt against the Turks. The different actions, military actions of the Greeks fighting for their independence, and also the other, and also some other Slavic nations on the Baltic Peninsula fighting for their independence. They went on and on for several years with various success. So the Turks were quite effective in suppressing the rebellions. So they also tried to do that with extreme cruelty, so to prevent people from rebelling again. So, for example, the Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople, oh no, some Metropolitan, no, it was the Patriarch, he was hung on at the gate of Constantinople, just to demonstrate people that they should not revolt and to intimidate people. But despite that, the rebellion grew, and then the other European nations could not help but notice it. On the one hand, they didn't want to engage in a war with the Ottoman Empire because it was still quite a powerful state. But at the same time, they could not close their eyes to the cruelties that the Turks perpetrated towards Christians, with thousands of people being killed. So they tried, at first, they tried to reason with the Ottoman Empire and to ask it sort of to make it stop the repressions and to give more autonomy, to give more rights to Christians in the Ottoman Empire. But the Sultan resisted all of that. He felt that he was quite powerful. And at some point, Russian and English troops the fleets, they started military actions against the Turks. And it was Russia who started this war. It was one of those wars in the series of wars between Russia and Turkey. But on one occasion, Russia and England participated in a battle together. That was the famous Battle of Navarino. This is Ayvazovsky's seascape of the Battle of Navarino. And on that occasion, both Russian and English fleets participated in this battle together. The English admiral was the commander-in-chief, and the Russian fleet was obeying him. But at one point in the battle, the English admiral didn't want to destroy the Turkish fleet completely, because England was trying to balance between keeping the power of Turkey to counterbalance Russia and, trying to make Turkey still stop the repressions. So the English admiral was not acting very decisively, and the Russian fleet did. And then the English admiral had to follow this as well, and the Turkish fleet was completely annihilated. That was a great battle, a great victory, and that led to the complete annihilation of the Turkish fleet, which in turn, after some time, led to the Turkish defeat in the war. And it was finished with the Adrianople Peace Treaty in 1829. Both sides, so Russia and Turkey, made mutual concessions. Russia gave up the part of Moldavia and Wallachia offered to it by the Turkish side. So those parts of Moldavia and Wallachia, which the Russian troops had already conquered, while the Ottoman Empire agreed to grant broad autonomy to Greece. And this actually created this Greek independence, although the actual independence, official independence, was only proclaimed in London in 1830, which gives a reason to many people who say that, Greece gained independence due to Allied efforts in 1830. Of course, there were Allied efforts, but of course it was largely this war between Russia and Turkey which produced this Greek independence. And to commemorate this, in St. Petersburg, this beautiful gate was erected. It's called the Moscow Triumphal Gate in St. Petersburg. If you ever go to St. Petersburg, remember this marks the independence of Greece. The fact that Greece is now independent is somehow connected with this arc in St. Petersburg. Symbolically, of course. Now, the next page in the relationships between Russia and England, which had a considerable effect on the later relationships, was the Polish question in the Russo-English relations. And before we discuss that, let me show you this sign. This is a sign in England. It tells you how much fish you can catch in a pond, in a lake. Is there anything that surprises you? Probably the second, the second sign, which explains the same, Prywatna woda zakaz wyetkowania, which explains the same thing in Polish. Why do you think? Why so? Did you know this fact, that the Polish language is the second most spoken language in England and the third most spoken in the UK after English and Welsh? How come? How come? Here is another thing just to show you what you can find all around England, Polski sklep, Polish shop, which is the point where if you ever emigrate to England and if you want to find Russian food, you go to Polish shop because they sell Eastern European things. But how come? How did it happen that there are so many Polish people in England? That's true. A friend of mine, a classmate of mine, actually told me that he was trying to do some research, and he wanted to find. Well, he saw a lot of immigrants, of course, so he wanted to find some place where he could do this research and find the English. So he went to some of the islands, and the first person he met there walking down the hill was a Polish man. So they are all over the place, which is fine. But when did it start? It started in 1830 and 1831, when Poland was part of the Russian Empire at the time. And in 1830, there was a rebellion. This time it was a rebellion of Poles, of the Polish people, against the Russian Empire. They wanted to gain independence. Although, the regime in Poland was still quite mild, because Alexander I and then Nicholas I, they tried to keep to give Poland to keep Poland's autonomy. So they had a lot of their own rules, and largely they were autonomous. But of course, they wanted their full independence. And then there was this Polish insurrection, which was suppressed, and a lot of Polish people fled to other countries. Those people who fought for the Polish independence, they fled to other countries, and that created a huge diaspora of Polish people in Western Europe, and in particular in England. Why in England? Because the English government was already, we'll speak about this politics of England. They were trying to keep the continental nations not very strong. Why? Because they wanted to avoid a strong opponent on the continent. So they tried to pit, France against Russia, Russia against Denmark, and so on and so forth. So that's what they are, what the English government is very good at, playing this geopolitical chess. So they, of course, supported the Polish insurrection, saying this is a fight for democracy, this is a fight for Polish independence, for freedom against this brutal autocratic Russia. And in 1831, thousands of Polish insurgents, powstańcy, and their families, fleeing persecution by the Russian imperial authorities, fled the borders of the Kingdom of Poland. They settled in various European countries, getting sympathy from the public which exerted pressure on governments and parliaments. It was the Polish émigrés who sought to create an extremely unflattering image of Russia as a strangler of freedoms and a hotbed of despotism, threatening civilized Europe. Polonophilia and Russophobia became important components of European public opinion from the early 1830s. So that was the first wave of people who started to stoke up to keep up those anti-Russian sentiments. And when Emperor Nicholas I went to England, of course, the English special services had to protect him, to keep him safe. And at one point, he forgot everything because he was overwhelmed by good feeling towards the English people. And it was during the horse races. So he went right into the crowd of people to shake hands. And of course, the special services were shocked, and they were very much afraid, because there were a lot of Polish immigrants in the crowd. So they were afraid that somebody might kill him. But on that occasion, everything passed well, and nobody killed him and nobody injured him. And this sets the stage for the next chapter in this competition between the empires, the Great Game. Well, technically speaking, the Great Game begins only in the 60s and even in the 80s of the 19th century. But I decided to show you the sequence, the succession between the various events which begin in the 1930s and continue, well, they basically haven't finished. The Great Game, unfortunately, still goes on, and we'll see that. So what is the Great Game? The Great Game was a political and diplomatic confrontation that existed for most of the 19th century between the British Empire, the Russian Empire over Afghanistan, and neighboring territories in Central and South Asia. This is the narrow understanding of the Great Game. But generally, we can say that this is a game between England and Russia for geopolitical influence, especially, well, you might want to research this yourselves, but from what the impression that I got from reading various materials on this is that primarily it was sort of always initiated by England. It was sort of their attempts to limit Russia and sort of to limit the Russian expansion, to limit the Russian growth, and therefore to sort of preserve the world for themselves. You know, there's a good English proverb, the world is your oyster, which is a good proverb, but in this case we can say that about the British Parliament, or about the British government. They wanted to keep the world as their oyster. And then we'll probably have a class when we discuss these macro tendencies. But you will see, even now, before we go on, I should say that, just think, can you think of the biggest countries in the world globally throughout history? Which countries have been the biggest countries in the world throughout history? Unparalleled biggest countries. What are they? Yes, well, of course, empires. The Roman Empire only occupied the Mediterranean. Well, it reached into England, right? Germany. It was Britain, the British Empire, of course, over which the sun never set, right? And what was another country like that? We just don't think about it like this, but it's true. The Russian Empire. The Mongolian Empire, it was big, of course, like China, of course, is a great empire. But none other country in the world has ever been that big as the British Empire and the Russian Empire. But the British just... Well, anyway, they controlled a lot of territories around the globe, and Russia controlled a lot of territories around the globe as well. So largely, these are the two largest, biggest countries in the world in history ever. We're not speaking of, you know, the grandeur, the culture of the Roman Empire and other things. I'm just speaking plainly of the territory and the power. Yes, that's right. The two big empires. So this Great Game can be understood in this context. England was afraid of the Russian growing influence. It was afraid that Russia was going to capture India from the crown of the British Empire. And yeah, so Britain Russia was fearful of British commercial and military inroads into Central Asia, and Britain was fearful of Russia adding the jewel in the crown, India, to the vast empire that Russia was building in Asia. This resulted in an atmosphere of distrust and the constant threat of war between the two empires. Britain made it a high priority to protect all the approaches to India, and the great game is primarily how the British did it. Historians with access to the archives have concluded, and British historians as well, that Russia had no plans, no real plans involving India, as the Russians repeatedly stated. But the British were afraid. But so this is, the great game is mainly about Afghanistan, but of course it all began much earlier. And now we're going to speak of a military conflict of 1853-1856, which erupted between Russia and a coalition of countries, Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, France, and England. And there was a small kingdom of Sardinia, but that could be discounted, I think. So generally it was a big coalition between Turkey, France, and England, very powerful nations of that time, and Russia on the other side. The British tried to use their advantage in the fleet, in their naval power. So they tried to attack Russia on various fronts. They attacked, well, we all know about the Crimea. We call it the Crimean War. But you probably know, you don't know much, that the British also tried to attack St. Petersburg, and they also bombarded Solovki. They wanted to capture Solovki as well. For those of you who might have issues with geography, Solovki is here. That's in the White Sea, not far from Archangel. So the British knew this place very well. And this is a lithograph showing you the British fleet bombarding Solovki. Of course, that would give them a very convenient military base, not far from the Russian shores. But that was unsuccessful. So these are the Solovetsky Islands. There's this famous monastery, which is the stronghold. Of course, they were trying to demolish this. And when I went to Solovki, this is a story that they tell you. If you go on a tour to the Solovetsky Islands, if you take a tour, they will tell you about this episode as well. So the British fleet bombarded Solovki for several hours, for 8 hours. Of course, there was a lot of smoke, and they were expecting that the Solovki monastery would be completely demolished by those bombs that they sent it. But when the smoke floated away, they were, of course, very much surprised that the monastery stood as it stood. Actually, they did not cause any damage at all, almost any damage at all. Just look at these stones. The walls are made up of boulders, of huge boulders, huge stones. And the English, the English steel, metal bombs could not do any damage to them. And there is only one place where an English bomb broke the wall. It was the wall of one of these cathedrals, I think the big cathedral. And now there is a memorial plaque which says that only this one wound the English fleet inflicted on the Solovetsky monastery. And so there was sort of a hole, and that was the only hole that they made in the walls. So it was sort of a miraculous salvation. And the British commander felt very much ashamed that he couldn't do anything, but he literally couldn't do anything. So because the fortress wasn't demolished, it wasn't destroyed, they of course could not go and send their soldiers there, seamen, to occupy it. The garrison, the Russian garrison was there, and so the British fleet had to go away. They also bombarded Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky, but there they didn't have success either. So the British concentrated their efforts on the Crimea, and it was a difficult campaign for England as well. Lots of English soldiers died. But as you know, this campaign wasn't successful for Russians either. The war was lost. And you know, I read an interesting piece of research which spoke about the role of newspapers in that war. That was the first war, the first European war, where the newspapers played any role. Reporting was rather quick by those standards, so within maybe several days, the public in Britain already knew about the new developments in the Crimean War. And common British people read about this, so they followed the war, what was going on. And the British newspapers wrote more about the success of the English troops. And because of this, well, of course, they wrote about their success as if they were already sort of winning the war. But there was a curious fact, and this is this piece of research that I read, that Nicholas I, the emperor, and then I think his son Alexander as well, they did not completely trust the Russian commanders and generals. I think you can understand why, because the generals, of course, are interested in showing their success. So they read English newspapers. And because of that, they tried to counterbalance information. But that played a bad joke on the Russian emperor. Why? Because they got an impression that the war was almost lost, whereas in reality it wasn't. And well, the Emperor Alexander II finally decided to conclude peace, right, to finish the war, to surrender largely. And well, part of that may have been the influence of the newspapers. Richard, do you have a question? Yes.
Sorry, should be called the Crimean War or the Eastern War?
Well, they call it somehow the Eastern War, but they also call it the Crimean War. They know this place named Crimea very well. You will see that.
Which one is predominant?
I couldn't tell. I don't know really. It really depends. I think it depends on whose literature you're reading, whether you're reading French, the French literature, or the English literature, and then if you're reading the English literature, whether it is highly specialized literature, and what the political stand of the researcher is. I think it also depends on what they want to call it, the Eastern War or the Crimean War. Yeah. Yeah, all right. So well, I don't think this is really that's important. You'll see that that they associate the Crimea very much with the Eastern War, even if they call it this name. So this is the monument to the sunken ships, which was built in 1905. Built to honor and to commemorate the ships that were sunken, drowned here at the entrance to the bay at Sebastopol, to prevent the English ships from entering it. And that staved off the defeat, and that enabled the Russian troops to continue fighting for a long time. Now you can see it on 200 rubles banknote. In England, there is also a monument. I showed you this monument to pair it up, to give a pair to the English monument. Right in the center of London, on Whitehall, there is a monument to this Eastern, or to the Crimean War. And you see that there is Crimea inscribed here. This is the central piece, and then the two other pieces were added later. And the inscription on the central one says, "To the memory of 2,152 officers and privates of the Brigade of Guards who fell during the war with Russia in 1854-56, erected by their comrades." So this monument is not a victory monument. They don't say this is a victory. Hello. They don't call it this way largely. Avoid calling it a victory, but this is rather a memorial to the fallen soldiers, to the people who fell in that war. So this is another view, a view from the other side. See, Crimea, and these are the soldiers here. And who are these people on the two sides? In 1861, these two other figures were added. One of them is Florence Nightingale. Florence Nightingale was a lady who came along with the troops to the Crimea and helped to bandage the wounded. And she also, so she was a medical nurse, and she was also responsible for organizing the medical service in such a way that very few people started to die from wounds. Before that, almost 100% or 90 something percent of soldiers who were wounded died in hospitals because of lack of modern medical care. But she organized this in a way that vice versa, only very few percent started to die from the wounds. And the other one is Sidney Herbert. Remember, we watched this piece of video about Count Vorontsov, who was the Russian ambassador to England at the beginning of the 19th century. So Sidney Herbert was his nephew. He was the son of, he was his grandson. He was his grandson, of course, of Count Vorontsov. He was the son of his daughter, Maria, I think, who was married to an English earl. And he was the military minister at the time. So that was, of course, the irony of fate, that one descendant of Count Vorontsov was leading the English troops. And here in Russia, his uncle, Mikhail Semyonovich Vorontsov, was, well, one of the commanders on this side. So some more pictures for you to take in. So these are the English soldiers in their typical outfit at that time, with those Scottish hats. And here, well, the inscriptions also say Alma, Inkerman, Sebastopol, well, commemorating those places where a lot of people died, and those places which were household names among the British at the time. As I said, everybody read the newspapers. They kept reading those place names in the newspapers, which led later on to the appearance of such place names on the map of Britain. So this is Sebastopol in Wales. See, Sebastopol, the UK. Well, various motives could be for these place names to appear in England, in the UK. Why? Well, some of those officers who came back, they might have wanted to sort of immortalize that time of their war in Russia, and they might have called part of their estate Sebastopol, or it might have been called by some local people as just a prominent name, a place which is far from somewhere. Yeah, and another one, Balaclava Road. They also have Alma and other places like that in the UK. And of course, the word balaclava was immortalized in the name of this hat. Initially, Balaclava is a place name in the Crimea, but it is a well-known fact that the British were freezing to death in the Crimea. Lots of them, they were not dressed for the Russian climate, as always, yes. But at some point, they sort of they came up with this new sort of headwear, which could be worn like this, which protected your face as well. And that later on, the word balaclava as a name for a hat first appears in 1881. But of course, this is like a descendant of those problems that the British had in their war in the Crimea. Right, and then comes this piece of news that I wanted to show you. And at the beginning of this present war, in Ukraine, the British Prime Minister said when he met with the English troops, and he said, in 1856 we kicked Emperor Nicholas's bottom, and we can do that again. And I just wanted to show there was a nice piece of reporting about this history of the Crimean War and about the problems that the British had there. So I found it here. Let's watch this bit. It will be in Russian, of course. Well, and yeah, we'll stop here because this already is about France. But I also remember that the word cardigan, well, as a piece of clothing, it also owes its name to Lord Cardigan, because again, it's something that you something warm that you put on yourself, right? When it's cold. Cardigan, yes, that's a it's the origin of the name of the piece of clothing goes back to the name of to the title of Lord Cardigan. Same as, but well, not same as, but sort of balaclava is another piece that commemorates this war. Right, so I found a nice summary by Labanov Rostovsky in a later article, which says basically this war was an attempt on the part of a coalition of European powers to redress the balance of power which had tipped too strongly in favor of Russia. But it was also the only time in history when England and Russia faced each other in a major armed conflict. In accordance with the saying of Bismarck about the whale and the bear, he said that the English power is like the whale and the Russian power is like the bear. So they basically have nothing to divide. They have nothing to fight about because the whale exists in the sea and the bear exists on the shore. So they shouldn't fight. But paradoxically, they do. It showed that the British Navy was helpless against Russia's landlocked power. The sanguine hopes that British strategists had put in a massed naval attack against St. Petersburg and the other Russian ports in the Baltic Sea resulted in two futile summer campaigns. Thereafter, the British were forced to scale down their plans and concentrate their aims on the destruction of Russian naval power in the Black Sea. This was achieved by the siege and capture of the Russian naval base of Sebastopol and the demilitarization of the Black Sea. Clause inserted in the Treaty of Paris, which closed the war. So the Russian fleet had to be destroyed. And that was, and Russia was, according to the Peace Treaty of Paris, Russia didn't have a right to have a fleet on the Black Sea. However, this advantage of the British was of a very temporary nature because 15 years later, Britain was forced to accept its cancellation. So after after almost 30 years, Russia started to build a fleet on the Black Sea again, and the British couldn't do anything about this. Right, the next page in the competition between England and Russia comes in the Balkans in the 60s and in the 70s. In the Balkans. Why the Balkans? It's always the Balkans, you know. Many wars begin in the Balkans because there are so many small nations there, and there's such an inflammable piece of territory that it's easy to start a war because of something. Right, but at that time, of course, that was an inflammable point. Why? Because Greece had gained independence, but there were still quite a lot of Slavic nations, Christians, who were part of the Ottoman Empire. And, well, they didn't always have a sweet life. And from time to time, they started those rebellions, and the Turks suppressed them with equal cruelty. And the British were in two minds, you know. The British always had to sit on the fence. On the one hand, they had a moral obligation, well, they were supposed to have a moral obligation to help the suppressed Christians. On the other hand, they were afraid of Russia becoming too powerful at the expense of Constantinople. And their nightmare was to see Russia on the straits in Constantinople. They were very much afraid that Russia would take Constantinople, and this was actually it was an actual plan of Russia at some point. So unlike India, where Russia didn't intend to go, Constantinople was a Russian aim. So it was always kept in mind as the biggest prize. And the British, of course, had to, wanted to oppose that. The British policy, and this is a useful quotation which explains and which is quoted much. which explains the British geopolitics, what they want from the world. And it was phrased by Lord Palmerston, for a long time Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. He said it. He said, "Therefore I say that it is a narrow policy to suppose that this country or that, so one country, is to be marked out as the eternal ally or the perpetual enemy of England. We have no eternal allies, and we have no perpetual enemies. Our interests are eternal and perpetual, and those interests it is our duty to follow." So this sums up very neatly British geopolitics. They have their own interests, so their trade routes. They used to have colonies as their interests, but now they have these interests of keeping themselves as the arbiters in a game. And they can ally with that or this country in history, but never with one and the same country, right? They support the weaker enemy of the two. Why? Because they don't want the stronger enemy to win. And they view, well, basically they view all these big countries as their competitors, if not enemies. The prime minister who is going to feature largely in this Balkans war of where Russia and Turkey met again was Benjamin Disraeli. Benjamin Disraeli was Queen Victoria's favorite prime minister, and he really fought like a lion for British interests around the world. But that made him a bitter enemy of Russia, unfortunately. And he did quite a lot to make the British Empire bigger. And as you see, the British Empire is the one over which the sun never set, right? It begins in Canada, goes all the way to South America and Mesoamerica, to Africa, where they had a lot of colonies, to India, Singapore, Hong Kong, and finally Australia and New Zealand. That's a huge empire, huge empire.
And we just lost it.
We'll speak about their losing the empire. That's not as easy as you think. They still have a lot of influence over the Commonwealth.
They both with France have the rights to Canada.
Yeah. Well, still, it's more nuanced than we think. And where were they afraid of Russia? They were afraid of Russia in India, as we saw. But they were also afraid of Russia here in Constantinople. Why? Why in Constantinople? Look, what is the shortest way to India? It's through the Suez Canal, right? So who controls the Suez Canal controls trade with India. Now, who controlled the Suez Canal at the time? No, Turkey, the Ottoman Empire. And if Russia gained control of Constantinople, it could later on gain control over the Suez Canal. That's what the English thought. Well, because Egypt was part of the Ottoman Empire.
Didn't England and France own the Suez Canal itself?
I may be wrong about the technicality, but of course it was under control of the Ottoman Empire largely. You see, because Egypt itself was controlled by Turkey. And that's why they were afraid that Russia would gain Constantinople and the Straits, because later on that could pose a threat to the Suez Canal from the English point of view. So Disraeli tried to scheme fiercely against Russia, and as his biographer says, he never wavered, he never hesitated in his conviction that Russia was a threat to civilization. He supported the weak and bankrupt Ottoman Empire solely because he believed that the insignificant and corrupt Turks posed less of a threat to Europe than the slavery and barbarity of the Tatars. Well, that's us. And the most difficult part of his career was keeping England from collaborating with Russia against Turkey in 1876, when Gladstone was doing everything in his power to stir up the humanitarian sympathies of the English people. So why was it the most difficult task for Disraeli to prevent England from collaborating with Russia in 1876? What happened in 1876? That year saw a large-scale rebellion on the part of Bulgarians. So now this time it was Bulgaria and Bulgarians who insurrected, who rebelled against Turkey. And the repressions were so brutal that the whole Europe was indignant. The whole Europe was indignant. And in England itself, the public opinion was for Britain to help Russia in a war against Turkey, to liberate the Balkan nations, the Slavic nations. And Gladstone is the next prime minister who was in opposition to Disraeli and who was doing everything to sort of make England help Russia, or at the very least keep from preventing from sort of starting a war against Russia, because Disraeli wanted, when he saw that Russia was gaining success in that, he was even on the verge of announcing war on Russia instead of Turkey. But now let's look at what happened in 1876. So as I said, there was a huge rebellion of Bulgarians in 1876, and it was brutally suppressed by the Turks. And these were what we would call medieval cruelty. So they, when they defeated the people who were militarized, when they defeated the Bulgarian insurgents with weapons, they started to carry out repressions on the peaceful people, on women and children. And the Batak massacre is probably the brightest episode in those repressions. So this is a piece of wood on which the Turks cut the heads of the people. And what they did, they made pyramids of skulls. This is the only photograph that I'm going to show you. I'm sorry if it is disturbing, but it's just to show you what was happening in Turkey at the time. Those were pyramids of heads and of bones, and those were largely of the peaceful people. People were put on a pole, on a stick. You know, there was this medieval torture when people were put on a stick. And you know, in that village, the head of that village, who said, "We're going to make peace, don't kill the women," he was put on this sharp stick and roasted until he died. And then English journalists, and in this case, this was an American journalist who was also writing for the Daily News in England. He played a big role, by the way. He prevented the British government from spreading propaganda about this Russian-Turkish, or about the Bulgarian rebellion, because he showed the English people what was really going on. It was very difficult because the government outlets, the government newspapers in England didn't want to show this. They said that it wasn't as cruel, but he wrote about that from first-hand experience. What he wrote in the Daily News in May 1876. "Suddenly we pulled on the reins with a cry of horror. Right in front of us stood a mountain of skulls, mixed with bones from every part of the human body, almost complete skeletons, clothing, human hair, and rotten flesh. A terrible stench spread around. All the skeletons were dressed only in women's shirts. They were all women and girls. We counted more than 100 skulls, not including those hidden under other bones. All the skulls were separated from the skeletons. All the skeletons were headless." And this is actually a piece of, at one point I gained access to, paid access to the British archives of newspapers. And this is a screenshot of this real newspaper of those days. The assassinations at Constantinople, Muslim atrocities in Bulgaria. Dark rumors have been whispered about Constantinople during the last month of horrible atrocities committed in Bulgaria. The local newspapers have given mysterious hints about correspondence from the interior, which they have been obliged to suppress, and so on and so forth. Right. An intelligent Turk, so it is too soon yet to attempt to ascertain with any degree of exactness the number who have been killed. An intelligent Turk who has just arrived estimates it at 18,000. Bulgarians speak of 30,000 and of the destruction of upwards of 100 villages. I pass over the stories of the burning of 40 or 50 Bulgarian girls in a stable and the massacre of upwards of 100 children in the village schoolhouse, surprised by the Bashis, because though they are repeated everywhere in Constantinople, I have no sufficient authority to enable me to express an opinion on their truth. Right. England says a Turkish journal will defend us. England says a Turkish journal will defend us against Russia, while we'll look after our rebels. The duty is, it seems to me, clear: either non-intervention in its fullest sense. So this is what the journalists write, that the English should either not intervene, allowing the Turks and Christians to fight out the issue between them, and not giving support to Turkey, as we're now doing in various ways indicated in my last letter. Or, if our interest requires us to give a certain support, then to exact as the first condition that Christians shall be treated on equality with the Turks. The thing, however, now to be done is to put a stop without delay to the massacre. England cannot afford to allow Russia to take credit for being the single friend of the Christian population in this country. Right. So what happened in 1876? I'm not going to give you all the details of that war, of course. I'm just giving you the outline because this is an important episode in the Russian-English relationships. But what I think is true is this quotation by a Bulgarian historian, Mitev, who wrote that the English people, the public opinion, tied the hands of their government, depriving it of the opportunity to assist Turkey in the war against Russia, or to declare war on her itself. Those atrocities were later on monumentalized in pictures, for example, by Konstantin Makovsky, Bulgarian Martyrs in 1876, which shows you a destroyed church with the interiors destroyed and one Bulgarian girl already killed, raped and killed, and another one who is prepared to be raped and killed by Turkish Bashis. Disraeli was furious. He sent an ambassador to Turkey, a special envoy, but then he wrote about him in fury. Salisbury seems to have many prejudices, and he doesn't realize that the main task for which he was sent to Constantinople was to keep the Russians away from Turkey, not to create ideal conditions for Turkish Christians. He turns out to be more Russian than Ignatieff, the Russian ambassador. Well, and as a British historian later wrote, the Russian foreign policy throughout the crisis pursued mainly peaceful and limited goals of supporting Bulgarians. However, the newspapers portrayed Russia as this huge monster, and this kept happening. This is 1877. This is Turkey, as it is called, the sick man of Europe, and the Russian octopus who is trying to get hold of Poland. It's strangling Poland. It already has Finland, and it's trying to take parts of Turkey. Right, and the other countries in Europe also portrayed in different other shapes. So a war followed in 1877, 1878. Russia fought this war against Turkey, and Russian troops they reached Constantinople. They were in the suburbs of Constantinople, but they stopped there. Do you know why? Because the English fleet was stationed here, and Disraeli couldn't bear it any longer. he said that if Russians start to take Constantinople, and it was almost helpless, there were almost no troops because they had been defeated somewhere on the way. The Turkish fleet was destroyed, the Turkish army was destroyed. Constantinople was lying bare for Russians to take it barehanded. And the British government intervened. They sent a message to the Russian government that if Russian soldiers enter Constantinople, England will enter a war against Russia. And Alexander II probably got afraid, or just he was too cautious. The Russian emperor, Alexander II. He was, yeah, probably he thought that it might be a big war again. He didn't want another big war. And he stopped the Russian troops. So there was a peace treaty signed between Turkey and Russia at San Stefano. It's called the San Stefano Peace Treaty. Well, this is just to show you a famous picture, Shipka, by Vasily Vereshchagin, who was a fashionable painter at the time. He was a battle painter. So this famous picture shows you triumph together with death and disaster, because this was, of course, a victory that the Russian troops won. That was over the Turks at Shipka, at one of the passes in the mountains in Bulgaria. And here on the left, you see General Skobelev on a white horse and victorious Russian troops hailing him with their hats. But in the foreground, you see dead bodies of Russian soldiers, Russian and Turkish soldiers, which is a price for that victory. And he tried to portray war as it is, with both sides, right? With the heroic side, but also with the tragic side. And later on, his pictures were exhibited in London, and it had a rather a different reception than they had in Russia. For example, this is Stasov's review. It is in Russian, but I had it translated into English. Again, about Vereshchagin's exhibition in London, which was published on the 23rd of July in 1879, so after the war, in the Novoye Vremya newspaper, when his pictures were exhibited in England. First of all, it's necessary to draw general attention to a curious fact that has come to light regarding this very exhibition. This is the extraordinary hatred against Russia and everything Russian that currently reigns among whole classes of English society and in its mouthpiece, the English press. Almost all the London press organs known for their Russophobia have now acted in this way. The Globe, Pall Mall, The Standard, The Morning Post, but the Times, which, as is well known, currently leads the Russophobes, has surpassed them all. Paintings depicting scenes from the last Russo-Turkish War were a constant topic of conversation for many visitors to the exhibition. In their conversations, the paintings and the artists remained completely unimportant, but at the same time, the most passionate, most savage hatred for the Russian campaign and Russian liberation exploits was expressed. Exploits podvigi. So as the reader sees, not a step without political hatred and arrogance, not a step without frost and some of our inconveniences of Russian life and their own perfections, without the greatness of English statesmen and their profound vision. So as I said, the war ended rather politically, rather favorably for Russia. This is the San Stefano Peace Treaty. This was supposed to be the territory of Bulgaria. Can you recognize this? This is Greece. This is Bulgaria. So it was supposed to have entry into the Mediterranean Sea. Well, the Kingdom of Montenegro, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the rest of that was still kept as part of the Ottoman Empire with a large autonomy. What did Disraeli do? He said, we cannot agree with this. This gives Russia too many benefits, too much political influence. If Bulgaria has this sort of territory, Russia, through Bulgaria, will have access to the Mediterranean. And this sort of disturbs the balance of powers. So he said, let us call a summit in Berlin and there decide everything. So they called this summit in Berlin. It's called the Berlin Congress. That's my own picture. That's my own picture. When I was in Berlin, in this Rathaus in Berlin, there's this huge painting which shows you the Berliner Kongress from 1878. So in 1878, there was this big Congress of European nations. This is Disraeli. Where is this? This is Disraeli. This is Bismarck, the German chancellor. This is Gorchakov, I think either this or this, Gorchakov, the Russian chancellor, the Turks, and some other, oh, probably this is Gorchakov, yeah, and other statesmen from other European countries. And by very skillful diplomacy, by very skillful political manipulation, the Treaty of Berlin was completely different. Look at that. This is what happened to the Russian plans to make Bulgaria independent. This is the territory of Bulgaria, which it gained according to the Peace Treaty of Berlin. Bosnia and Herzegovina went to Austro-Hungarian Empire. So it halved наполовину меньше, halved the Russian victory and the Russian gains in the Russo-Turkish War. This was done by Disraeli, but Disraeli was even cleverer than that. Before the war, he promised support to Turkey, but not for free. Do you know what the British Empire gained for this promised support to the Turks in the Russo-Turkish War? It was Cyprus. Britain gained their protectorate over Cyprus in return for their promised support in the war. But after the war, he got something else from the Ottoman Empire. He got Egypt. And Egypt got the English protectorate after the Russo-Turkish War, again, as a promise of the British to keep supporting the Ottoman Empire. So, you see, he was accusing Russia of expansion, of expanding political ambitions. But who speaks of these two episodes, Cyprus and Egypt, gained by the British Empire just for their diplomacy and promised support of the Turks? So this summarizes this war. Laban and Rostovsky summarizes it. It suffices to say that England openly supported Turkey in this war, and that the really dangerous possibility of a new war flaring up between England and Russia when the British fleet anchored in the Sea of Marmara faced the victorious Russian army encamped at San Stefano. To avert the consequences of such a perilous international situation, the Congress of Berlin was called. If the Russians, as a result of their victory, were able to create a powerful and independent Bulgaria at the expense of British-supported Turkey, Lord Beaconsfield is Disraeli, was able to avenge this setback by a resounding diplomatic victory at the Congress. Bulgaria was reduced by half, and the Russians were forced to accept the scaling down by about 50% of the Treaty of San Stefano, which they had dictated to Turkey. So, but even in such a curtailed form, the Russian victory, of course, was resounding and very important for the freedom of Slavic nations in the Balkans. Just look at these flags. Does anything spring to your eyes? Does anything strike you as unusual? They all carry the colors of the Russian flag. And in Bulgaria's case, it's still, the pattern of the Russian flag. This is Bulgaria, this is Serbia, that one is Croatia, Slovakia, Czechia, the Czech Republic, and Slovenia. So this is a visual testimony to to the great deeds, to the great victories that the Russian army did in the Balkans, and to the sacrifice of thousands of Russian soldiers who fought for the independence of Slavic nations, of Christian nations, to give them back their independence back in the war of 1878, 1878. And just it's sad nowadays to look at the politics of these countries. Even when their flags show you how they appeared on the map again after centuries of being subjected to the Ottoman Empire. And now the way they behave, of course, cannot but cause sadness. So let us pause here, and then I'll finish this lecture in our second class. Let me now pause our recording.